I want to touch on some albums that maybe weren't the best comebacks. Specifically, what I want to do here is talk about albums that really did not exceed expectations for larger fan bases. Generally speaking, metal, rock, or otherwise, it takes a band or an artist 2 to 3 years to drop a new album, and if it's past that point, most people look at that album as a comeback. What are they gonna do on it? So I assembled some records here that I personally was incredibly disappointed by, or that live in the annals of history when it comes to metal and rock in terms of disappointment. The first one is probably going to be the weirdest reasoning of anyone on this list. I'm going with Tool's record, Fear Inoculum. A lot of people enjoyed this record, don't get me wrong, and I remember at the time the reception was very good, and actually I was someone who rated the record very positively at the time, but in retrospect, the reason I rated it high was more so as a standalone record, trying to take my own biases about the long wait out of the equation. This record, no matter what form it came in, was always going to be disappointing in some way. The sheer level of expectation and hype that was built up around Tool's return, and that people were so curious of their comeback, what it was going to sound like. So I think even if this record would have been a just clear-cut, blowout 10 out of 10 record, best prog record ever created in the history of progressive metal and rock, I still think it would have been somewhat of a disappointment just because of how much was riding on it. And if I was judging this album based on their prior material, I don't think there was really anything done on this thing to warrant the level of expectation and hype, and I don't think the payoff was necessarily that great. Next up, I want to shout out Bring Me the Horizons record, Post-Human Next Gen. There's a couple of songs on this thing that I actually loop quite a bit, but as a whole, I can't lie and say that this record wasn't very disappointing for one reason. The Bring Me the Horizon camp of Post-Human got so many people excited. It was a near flawless modern metal and rock album. It was full to the brim with bangers, so many fantastic songs on this thing. You even had Anthony Fantano, who had consistently hated and ragged on Bring Me the Horizon throughout the years, loving the hell out of this thing. Almost gave it a 9 out of 10. And I don't know if it was because Jordan was out of the band and so it was a very mismatched album that somewhat had his input, somewhat didn't. The fact of just how fucking long it is, some of the overproduction to it, and just generally speaking some rather weak ideas. Not to mention the fact it all got framed in this lens of being so futuristic and so looking towards the future, but in the grand scheme of things, all of the ideas that they brought to the table here felt extremely dated. If I remember right, that's something Anthony Fantano said about it as well. There are still some good tracks on here, don't get me wrong, but considering the groundwork that Post-Human Survival Horror laid for the band and how it felt like a new era, I think it's fair to judge this album considering it's a continuation of that, and if the two were not even related, I feel like you could just judge this album as is, but considering we had to wait throughout pretty much the entire pandemic to get this thing, I think it's rightfully criticized for just how weak it feels in comparison to the content on Post-Human Survival Horror, and I don't know if that's more of a testament to just how good that material was, or if it's a testament to how bad some of the material on Next Gen is, or a combination. You decide. Next up, Metallica's record, Hardwired To SelfDestruct. There is a whole host of Metallica records that could be put here. Metallica, unfortunately, have gotten the reputation of making some stinker albums in their discography. It is all over the place, it's a roller coaster, and I don't think that Metallica has done anything decent since about the early to mid 2000s, and that is even a stretch. There was a humongous gap between this record and their last one, Death Magnetic, but the reason why this one was disappointing is not so much that people had great expectations, because up until that point, everyone understood that Metallica was way past their prime and just weren't making great music anymore. It was the fact that this was being touted as a comeback and a return, a new renaissance period of their thrash metal style. No longer were they just going to be making dad rock and weird-ass music with weird-ass production, it was going to be a return to form. And it came out the other side feeling very pandery and very weak. It felt like they were trying to emulate old Metallica. They felt like a Metallica cover band covering themselves. And that's just really funny, and it doesn't help that this record was so fucking bloated. It's absolutely insane. This record could have been about half as long and it would have been perfectly fine. It actually probably would have benefited a lot from being a lot shorter, but that isn't the timeline we got. And I think more than ever, the past few Metallica records has shown that they don't know how to cut a track listing. doing. They'll just make these long-ass bloated records, and that even though they are performing the style that they performed in their earlier days, it is so much weaker than before and leaves you with that question mark, well, why wouldn't you just listen to the other material? Maybe it's worth one listen, but past that point, it's just incredibly weak. This is one of my own personal picks, and it might be a little controversial, but I'm gonna say Veil of Maya's record, Matriarch. Veil of Maya have always been one of my favorite bands. I adore Eclipse. It is my favorite deathcore record of all time. I personally believe it is as perfect of a deathcore record as you could get, specifically for the technical side of deathcore, and then Matriarch came around and it just completely left me wanting. Veil of Maya, much like a lot of other deathcore bands around that time, specifically like Born of Osiris comes to mind, somewhat Within the Ruins, they transitioned their style to the progressive metalcore djent style that was popular at the time. The difference with Veil of Maya is they already had the djentisms in their music on records like Eclipse and even to some degree ID, but it wasn't until Matriarch that they went completely into the Born of Osiris, Invent Animate, Vilsharta type of style, the Periphery style, and just pretty much became a progressive metalcore band, and this would later continue on records like False Idol. I feel like there are some decent tracks in modern Veil of Maya, but I stopped caring about them in terms of the modern sphere a long fucking time ago. They left behind everything that made them unique as a band and replaced it with something that feels incredibly homogenous and just status quo to everything that you're getting in the progressive metalcore and djent subgenres, and that just leaves me wanting more because I understand what they are capable of, and seeing them sort of boil themselves down to this generic djent band really did disappoint me and just has not really gotten me excited since. Remember when I said there were some iconic historical albums in this list? We gotta talk about Morbid Angel's Elude Divinium Insanus. So there was a massive gap between this album and Heretic, their previous album. It was the longest gap and is the longest gap between Morbid Angel releases, and this thing is absolutely iconic. I don't think it needs much of an introduction, but if you're unfamiliar with this record, it's when Morbid Angel tried to become an industrial death metal band, and it just ended up sounding so corny. I actually revisited this album recently in preparation for this list, and while I do think that it sometimes gets a little bit too much hate considering there are some decent ideas littered throughout this thing, holy shit, the production sucks on this thing. It's also the fact that industrial death metal isn't a bad thing. It actually can be really good. You can see that with like a Null and Thrak to some degree, but it's not about the genres. It's about how they're executed, and it's corny and cringy as all hell, and the industrial elements just suck altogether. It's not the fact that they took a risk to be experimental, it's the fact that the way that they went about being experimental just blew. Anytime the industrial elements come on like gunshots feeling like some rip-off 9 Inch Nails, Marilyn Manson, Rob Zombie amalgamation, and then you combine it with their death metal style, it comes out the other side sounding like a parody, unfortunately, and so that is why this album just consistently lives in infamy in terms of the genre. Another album that I 100% know I'm gonna be in the minority on because I was in the minority when I talked about it on release, Possessed record, Revelations of Oblivion. I went back to this record recently, and I can admit it's fine, and I never said that it was a bad album. The reason why I feel like this album is bad is because it just standard bears after so long. Even though we publicly beefed, and you know, he called me out on Facebook and whatever, Jeff Becerra is an awesome dude. He is a badass, and the way that he bounced back in his story is absolutely incredible. But unfortunately, when you have something bad happen in your life, you are evidently exempt from any sort of criticism. This record is a perfectly fine Possessed album. The reason I felt it was a letdown is because it made me wonder what exactly the point of its existence was outside of a statement about Jeff, which if that's what it was intended for, fine, but the overhyping of this record, the reviewers, the publications that were saying this was the best death metal album of the year, no it wasn't. It was incredibly status quo, and it has nothing to do with them being an older band or me having some vendetta against Possessed. There are a ton of modern bands that have done amazing death metal albums. Cannibal Corpse, Obituary, Autopsy, all fantastic. And like I said, the material on this thing is absolutely fine. But considering how long it had been, I kind of wanted to feel a bit more bite and vigor, not necessarily experimentation, but just something to put a new spin on it after so long, and it felt like this record was born born out of 1985, and the issue with that is there are thousands of copycat bands copying what Possessed did back then. And I feel very similarly about this album that I do about Whitechapel's most recent album, where it feels more like a statement of, look what we can do now, we're the daddies of the genre. That's what I don't particularly like that much, is when a band feels like they have a pressure on them to make a record that shows who they are, instead of making an album that feels like it's not necessarily even going outside of their comfort zone, but just putting a fresh spin on it, because I will always take Seven Churches over this album, and it's not even close. Next up, Avenge Sevenfold's self-titled album. This was at such an odd time in Avenge Sevenfold's career. Their first two albums were metalcore albums, and live in infamy for that because they're very good. And then they released City of Evil, which, while it was a very different album and they went more into the heavy metal sphere and the thrash metal sphere, this album was iconic. It boasted a lot of singles that became iconic, it was used in a lot of internet culture at the time, and it was a good transitional period that I think paved the way for a lot of other bands that took influence from Avenged Sevenfold, as well as set the template for Avenged Sevenfold always changing their style thereafter. But this album was just mixed as a whole. It didn't feel nearly as strong as City of Evil. It was in a damn identity crisis where it didn't know what genre it wanted to be half the time. The production felt very shrill and not in a good way. The direction of the entire album just felt very all over the place. It didn't feel as heavy as their earliest albums. It didn't feel as catchy as City of Evil, and as a whole, it just felt directionless. And both the fanbase and critics were incredibly all over the place in terms of their reception of this thing, for good reason, because it's one of those Avenged Sevenfold records that just have no identity or bite to it, whereas even if you don't like some of their later albums, they're at least clearly going for a specific theme and full committing to that. They don't full commit to anything on this album. Next up, Green Day, Father of All. So, Revolution Radio, some people enjoyed it, but people started to notice that Green Day were losing their touch a bit. And on Father of All, they veered off of a cliff. This thing is weak from just about all metrics. It feels bare bones, it feels scant, it's not that long, and not in a good way. The garage rock isms are corny as hell, the mix on this thing is ass, the vocals suck, the riffs are weird, the lyricism feels incredibly out of touch, and I feel like Green Day became the very thing that when they were younger they talked bad about. They became corporate shills making really goofy dad rock music for merchandising and just trying to be hip and cool but missing the mark entirely. And they're a namesake band. I respect the hell out of them. I respect their politics nowadays. But with that being said, this album was a stinker. And I think this album just showed that once you get past your prime a little bit, you maybe should hand off the torch of the revolution to someone else. And it's not necessarily that it's a massively bad album, it's tolerable, but it's the fact that it's coming from Green Day that disappointed a lot of people who had bigger expectations for them, and Revolution Radio felt good enough and passable that people did not know what was coming around the corner at all. What are your guys' opinions of this topic? You can let me know down in the comment section below your picks for some of the most disappointing comeback albums of all time and your thoughts on my list. Agree or disagree, there is no wrong answer. Be sure to like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to join the review family today, and smash that notification bell to be notified of my future uploads. You know who it is, my name is Jay Morris, and I'm signing off saying farewell.